Hello and welcome to another episode of Life Talk, where we talk about real issues plaguing our community. So today we're going to be talking about sex, sexual revolution, and some of the impact that has had on our culture today. So this is going to be a really good one, and I'm really excited for you to tune in today. So I think you were talking a little bit about the sexual revolution and the impact that has made on us in history. Can you dive into that a little bit?
I think, since the 1950s, probably after the 1960s, we see a huge shift in our perspective when it comes to sex, and at a level that can be considered as a revolution. As a result of that, we have premarital sex has been increased at an alarming scale, teenage pregnancies, abortions, and much more than that, having, not only in a heterosexual context, but also in a homosexual context. And even now, we're having issues with transgender. We are having, sex not only with human beings, but also with animals, with kids. So this has a huge impact in our society, but also have a huge implication on the future of nations and in general society. So I think this is a time where we need to really stop and think and really reset our definition of marriage, sex, and related issues. So I believe this is a real life issue that we should discuss and really be part of the conversation that is going on around, especially with internet and with social media. This has been revolutionized and went far. So I hope this conversation, especially when we are having this live talk, would help reset somehow the issue about sex and related issues. That's what I want to say about sexual revolution that is taking place in before our eyes in our society, especially in the West. But also, this is not an issue of the West because of, as I said, internet and social media. This has been an issue for the rest of society, even in Africa and in the different worlds.
We'll get to it today, but as a lot of sexuality became more rampant, especially in the West, which is probably where most of internet culture came from and spread to the rest of the world. I think, the West is kind of the breeding ground for a lot of things that are coming as a result of the hypersexual culture that we have. So we definitely need to, like Dr. Beza said, double back and just think about okay, what is the purpose of sex? What are we doing it for? How can we do it constructively? In what context is it supposed to be appropriate and whatnot? And I guess that's just what we're here to do today. So,
I feel like times have changed throughout the years. I feel like the time now has caused a lot of people to steer towards hypersexuality. The drive is at an increase because there's so many things, through media. I feel like a couple of years ago, 20, 30 years ago, there weren't as many platforms there wasn't as easy of accessible platforms for people to visualize these things that are being projected, on TV. I feel like things were more limited a couple years ago, but now I feel like there are no limits to what is being seen, to what's being visualized. I feel like a couple years ago, when they would rate movies, PG-13 movies were a lot different than what PG-13 movies are now. The access, I feel like, is a huge part of the issues that the world is facing.
Exactly.
As far as how sex is affecting many people, millions of people.
Right. So yeah, it's incumbent on us to have this conversation because it's so prominent now. So we have to, for the sake of responsibility. As boring as that sounds.
So I think you all have given introductory remark on how important it is to talk about on this issue that is grabbing, your generation and even our generation too. So we need to really, get back into the drawing board and define sex. What is sex and what should be the appropriate context for sex to happen. So I think that's where we need to begin with redefining sex. For me, especially in this culture, in this popular culture, in today's culture, sex is, say, reduced to a physical act. Just putting male genitalia into a woman's genitalia. It's just, having, getting out with someone and having, food or coffee, and that's all. We become so utilitarian and lost the richness in the depths of that gift, great gift of a creator. Is it really just a physical act, or is it much more deeper than that? Is it creating bonding? Is it creating emotional connectedness, even spiritual connectedness, so that it helps unite men and women rather than just having pleasure? Of course, there is pleasure. There is procreation. We can talk about that. But how do you feel about it? When sex is reduced to such an elemental, reductive definition of sex, where it's just a physical act. It's not giving oneself to someone. Is that not deep than just having this physical? So what's your point on this?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind when you're talking about all that, I think, yeah, we can definitely make a case about all the ties and all the consequences that come as a result of, using sex in a utilitarian form. At the end of the day, the thing about sex is, yes, it's pleasurable, but just because it's pleasurable doesn't mean that just because something's pleasurable doesn't mean that you do it, You look at sex, and sex has it does have a biological function. And, I think when you go outside of that biological function and just misuse it for pleasure, it's like, we know this as adults, like anything that you do for the sake of pleasure is not always going to result in benefits or in your health, you know what I mean? Or in the well-being of anybody, And sex is no different. For it to be used only as a source of pleasure, It's just not a responsible use of it. And so when you look at just all the bad things that can come just as a result of using sex for pleasure, I think it speaks for itself. The case is made for itself. Like, it's not a good long-term solution, When everyone out here is just using sex for pleasure, look at the emotional damage that we're seeing in Western society today, how emotionally damaged that men and women are. This polarization that we're seeing here today, a lot of male versus female gender war, is a big result of just how much we're using sex only for pleasure, viewing each other in utilitarian effort. You know what I mean? Sexually transmitted diseases, that also speaks for itself. You know what I mean? It's a simple solution, like just the less promiscuity you have, the less the rampant that sexual diseases are going to transfer, Even beyond that, just those two things alone, it just speaks to the fact that, okay, we should step back as a society where pleasure is just available to us all the time. We need to step back and say, okay, well, this might not be the correct course of action to just say anything goes if it makes me, feel pleasure. We should step back and evaluate what it is. Like, why do our bodies require sex? You know what I mean? That's the other thing about sex, is like, it can't purely be for pleasure, because like our body requires it. Our body needs it to sustain itself, the same way that we get hungry, but we don't need to like eat all the time. There's a point where doing it for pleasure just doesn't make sense. So I think just going back to the biological roots will speak for itself before we make any other case about anything else. It's just dysfunctional outside of just normal use. So that's what I observed, at least. So
I like how you mentioned how you kind of like related it to eating, right? Sex can be very damaging when it is not handled correctly and when it's not in the bounds of where it needs to be. See, with how sex was designed to be, with sex comes a lot of responsibilities, and that builds endurance. That makes sex beautiful, that gives meaning to sex. But in today's culture, I feel like sex is meaningless. It's like Dr. Bislam said, it's a physical act, right? It's something that's simply done, not even thought about really, truly, from what I've seen. Just in my experience around me, sex was talked about casually. And it almost overwhelmed me. It almost made me feel like I was weird for not having these sexual thoughts before, or not speaking about sexual things with my previous friends when I was younger. Now I was introduced into a culture where sex was a common topic. So like you said with eating, just as if we eat unhealthily, like if we eat in a way where it's like we're just constantly eating to eat, right? It becomes damaging to our bodies, right?
Right.
We become unhealthy. We become sick, and eventually it could cause us to die, right? So that's the same thing with sex, right? If we're not even thinking about it, if we're just out here sleeping with whoever we want to and just feeding our sexual desires constantly, it'll lead us to sickness. These are cases that are very obvious. This is the reality of what we're facing, right? There's many people with sexual diseases that have lost their lives.
Yep.
There's communities that have been affected. You know, it doesn't just stop, you know, it's endless.
Absolutely.
So it is very damaging if it's not within the bounds that it needs to be in.
Absolutely.
No, it's true.
Yeah.
Robbie, is there anything you want to add on this conversation?
Yeah, I think Nathan brought a great point about responsibility. And I think as a culture, as a society, we need to really remind ourselves that it's our responsibility to handle our sex lives as seriously as possible. Because the cons of not doing that greatly outweigh, you know, the pros, you know.
Exactly.
Unwanted children,
You're
you know,
right. Right.
huge emotional damage you can cause in a child
Absolutely.
or in the parent. You know, unwanted children, STDs, life-changing mistakes happen when you're not, you know, being serious about your sex life. Hyper promiscuity in young people, you know what I mean? You know, it just seems like we live in a culture where young people are just having unbridled sexual freedoms, and it's being encouraged by adults. It's actually very sick. I was reading a news article where a health teacher gave an assignment for their students. I think they were in elementary school, where they asked the students to write down their sexual fantasies. Somehow this is related to health, right? So now we're educating our children on how to have sex, you know, and so it's getting to a point where it's just ridiculous. And I think our society would be a little bit more ordered if people just had monogamous marriages and had sex within that. It would create a lot of order. And I'm also very concerned that in today's age, there's really no emphasis on creating a strong family that can last generations, that will mean something, whose name will mean something, you know? I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I want to have a family with a crest and a symbol that means something 100 years later.
Right.
And that can only happen on the foundation of a stable family.
Exactly.
It cannot happen by just having sex indiscriminately, drunken hookups, and engaging in hookup culture, and not think you're not going to have brokenness if a child does come about in that.
Exactly.
Or an abortion, an unwanted abortion. Nobody wants to have an abortion.
Unwanted diseases.
Unwanted diseases. But
Yeah.
Also, we do able to maintain relationships, you know, in terms of, you know, having sex with too many people. You know, in the long run would damage the ability to form meaningful relationships for life. So that the prospect for having a stable family, the prospect in the future for having, you know, a family where you can have kids and grow, you know, good functioning kids, is being compromised.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's not being a good steward of what Creator has given to us. We're abusing it to an extent where it's very destructive, you know. But also, I would like to add into this conversation, you know, behind this revolution, there is an ideological battle, because restraint it requires this to restrain yourself until the appropriate time and until the appropriate context. And in the psychological world, you know, especially with Sigmund Freud, you know, when you restrain yourself and postpone pleasure, that could cause, you know, so many mental problems. A lot of psychological illnesses were associated with restraining yourself from having sex. That's a lie.
Repression.
That's a lie. That's not true.
Right.
That leads to discipline, not to psychosocial, emotional illnesses. It leads to discipline. It trains you to delay gratification, and it helps you develop perseverance, endurance, restraint, discipline, and this will help you not only in the area of your sexual life, but also in so many other areas of life. Because discipline, responsibility, endurance are the chemistry for a thriving society. They're chemistry for a very stable society. So that's a lie. That the being taught to kids, if you restrain, if you don't allow them to have this sexual relationship with whom they want and whenever they want, is a lie. It's not true. It's not supported by science. It's not supported by what we experience in society.
Absolutely.
That's not true. So that's one of the drives behind, for allowing, convince society, and this level of deception at a higher at a scientific community, at a higher level is really troubling. Where we're not telling the truth, we're just lying to promote an agenda, and we're not standing for the truth. So that also needs to be highlighted. That needs to bring to light, and not be responsible and promiscuous would take away, rob us of our ability to have a meaningful relationship, a lasting, long relationship with someone. Someone who has been gone through this kind of experiences will always struggle to really, having this with so many people. Absolutely. And then you got married. Yeah. Imagine all the memories you have from those experiences are gonna stay with you. All the heart, all the joy and the frustrations are gonna stay with you. Right. They're not going to leave you. Right. So why do you allow your body to suffer? And rob you that beauty of having a lasting and long, thriving relationship in life when you got married. Right. So we can argue as well from the consequence point of view. So what I will try to communicate here is sex is not just a physical act. We need to, it's not about pleasure, but there is a moral responsibility. There's higher reasons, and we should not impoverish sex. Right. It's a very rich thing that the Creator has given to us to really, have a stable family relationships in life. So we need to be good stewards, and we need to know when and how, so that we can have a meaningful, sexual life. So you have highlighted some of the consequences, but one of the things that I see, is teenage pregnancy, abortion. So, this will lead to pregnancy. Sometimes, as you say, Robbie, to unwanted, kids, but sometimes it could lead to abortion. So how is abortion and teenage pregnancy impacting our society? Do you have some comment on that, reflect on that as well?
I feel like, so with abortions, it causes a lot of psychological damage to the person that goes through it. It causes a lot of emotional damage. But it's crazy because, everyone has everything to say about it. You know what I mean? Like, people that don't go through it have a lot to say about it. But the people that do actually go through abortions and psychological, they actually hurt and they actually go through a lot of trauma. And they need to hear people who are understanding, compassionate, but also they need people in their lives. They needed those boundaries before. With teenage pregnancies and abortions, had there been certain guidelines and had there been people around them that defined what the Creator says sex is to them, they wouldn't have fallen into that situation, Yeah. They wouldn't have had to compromise. They wouldn't have to go through the emotional damages. And the people that caused it are the people that are saying, pro-abortions and pro this and but they're not the ones that are going through the experience, that are emotionally traumatized, that are damaged. They're not walking in that. So I feel like had the people that, would have helped these people truly been there, to guide their steps, they wouldn't have fallen to this. So, or had they known, or had they not been exposed to the sexual culture, they wouldn't have fallen to that point, they wouldn't have been led to that point.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Nathan, Robbie, anything to add on this?
Yeah, I think a lot, like you said, a lot could be said about the culture or the environment that children are growing up into that cause them to go down this route of promiscuity and all out just, finding, a lot of people say they're finding their freedom through sex, which I think when people use that language, they're just enabling addiction, honestly, because sex can be an addiction.
Yep.
But, you know, half of all Americans grow up without a father. You know, we know that fatherless women tend to be promiscuous. Fatherless boys tend to be promiscuous. You know, the role of a father is to protect their daughter from boys entering into the house. You know what I mean? Managing her dating life if she has one at that age, and being there to shoo away wolves who are coming with bad intentions. You know, and when people don't have that in their life, people are raised on a TV screen or on the iPad with no parental supervision. This is what happens.
Yeah.
And so there's not a contrast. They don't have a contrasting experience to know that this is wrong or right. This is just how life is, you know. And so growing up, seeing that, you know, can contribute to them thinking this is just normal. And I'm sure, you know, a person who has had that background could hear a conversation like this and think, what we're talking is alien, but this is just what it means to be normal, what it means to have a normal sex life, you know? And so, yeah, the environment, we're not speaking to how to fix these environments, how to address these environments.
Addressing it before it happens,
Before it happens.
Before it happens. But once it happens, not causing more damage, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Saying, don't do it, but instead, why? Like, you know what I mean? Or what caused this? You know, moving forward, how can we help you?
Yeah.
You know, because what the act, once a woman aborts her baby, the act has already been done. But instead of saying, no, what you did was bad, kind of like, you know, build a community around her to tell her that she is loved, you know, that she is protected. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That she is made in God's image. You know, she's an image bearer, that God loves her, and that he has a plan and purpose for her, and that that you will be there for her also with whatever she needs, with the resources she needs. You know, and that and then explain to her how damaging sex is, and that it led her to this point, and that she doesn't need it out of its bounds. You know, kind of teach her that, and teach communities, teach children before it's too late.
Yeah.
You know, because right now what's happening is there's a society that is pushing the agenda, right? Pushing
The commercial aspect of
right.
abortion too. We need to talk about that as well. As you say, you know, there's people behind this, you know, pushing on this thing, and there's a lot of industry working behind abortion. We need to know that as well. You know, definitely. As Robbie said, you know, a girl, you know, who've grown up in a dysfunctional family, maybe without a father. Imagine one of the causes of that is promiscuity. You know, in babies born, unwanted babies born, and they grow up with single mom, and it's one feeding the other. You know,
Right.
and a vicious cycle happening there. You also mentioned that the psychological impact that abortion would have on her life, and this is not just the regret in life. Many of them, when they were interviewed, they all, almost most of them have said that they have a regret in later life. You know, and there's guilt associated with it too, and that has a
Suicide too.
Suicide. Yeah, definitely suicide too. You know, so it has so many, you know, consequence impact when it comes to you know abortion. But it is presented as if it is just removing some unwanted part, or you know, for example, a cancer or a tissue, you know, something that you can, you know, an abnormal tissue that is in us removing. It's just like that. It's not killing. It's not killing. It's not murder. It's not, you know, but also, you know,
I feel like
it also reduces the value we attach to life. When we start, you know, to normalize abortion, then we start to normalize infanticide. When we normalize, you know, then look at, you know, euthanasia, you know, and taking away someone's life. That means the value we attach to life is being diminished. That's where it begins. You know, if you value life, value the fetus. We value life. We value, you know, we want to cherish life. If you want to cherish life, begin cherishing the life of the fetus. That's where it begins. Once you start, you know, diminishing the value of a fetus, in by implication, that would now your choice to abort but down the road, you'll be forced to do it. Imagine if you don't defend it right now.
So don't put yourself in that position.
Yes.
Like, don't allow yourself to have to deal with the consequences. Protect yourself, guard yourself. And honestly, I really want to talk about how, like, sex is a root cause to a lot of our problems, to a lot of the world's problems. It's all tied into so many things.
Yes.
As we mentioned some of them in the beginning of this podcast.
You have
Sexual
real life
diseases.
experience that you want to share about these things, real life experiences you guys want to share us about this. I know it's
It's very personal.
very
but-
personal, and
Nah, but it's okay.
but for the sake of our audiences, if anything you want to share, wherever it is, how this is damaging, how this is not fulfilling, at
No
least,
problem. So
you may not be you can talk about detail, but you can tell us how this was not fulfilling in life.
right. I mean, I can talk about it from a worldview perspective. Actually, everything that you guys were talking about, for the most part, I think, when you're looking at the root of these things, I think a lot of kids are just confused about what, like, their end point in life is about. I think there's, like, a wave of either nihilism or just irresponsibility in general that people don't, like, think that much about where they want to end up in life, especially from a young age, I know from a young age, because I was fortunate enough to grow up in, like, a healthy family, I knew I wanted to end up in a healthy family. And I wanted to have my own. And therefore, I understood, luckily, there's a lot of things I messed up in life, but one thing I understood from early age is I want to end up in that situation. And I knew, like, all these other sexual acts and whatever it may be is only going to hinder my end result, So, dear viewer, consider everything in your life. Like, is it taking you, like, where you want to be at the end of, at some point in your life, right? And so when I started, like, observing a lot of, like, when all of us reach that point where things stop going from just kids playing in the playground to now kids are starting to do, things with each other, the hanky-panky and all that other stuff, you start to, like, observe, you start to, like, develop your own sexual identity and stuff like that. But ultimately, like, I've realized with time, like, I was actually fortunate enough, I was questioning why are people, like, wanting to participate in things like hookup culture and stuff like that, because I don't know, how is that not going to lead to destruction? If you know that you're becoming so intimate with someone and then you're going to, like, split apart like that. But this is where families come from. This is where Robel said, like, legacies come from this. Life comes from this, It's not going to come without a consequence at some point, And so I think as I got older, yes, like, the temptation is there, because you have to look, it's not just about everything is working against you, right? Understand that people are profiting off of all of your sexual dysfunctions. The pornography industry is profiting off of you. The abortion industry is profiting off of you. Media in general likes to promote sex because sex, trauma, and, desire for wealth, that's what drives so much of the value economy that we participate in, So everything's going to be trying to pull you into, participating in this. There's going to be a lot of pressure from people and stuff like that. But I can say it was extremely, extremely tough to, like, resist that for a long time. Although I will say guys usually have an easier time because it takes a long time for most of us to actually be, like, sexually desirable to participate in that kind of stuff. So, that can lead to its own conversation. But for the most part, it gets easier as you get older to understand, like, okay, I'm actually approaching a time where, around, like, your mid-20s and stuff, you start to see the fruit of people's sexual dysfunctions and stuff like that. It starts to mature, People start to develop, like, all kinds of emotional issues, attachment issues. They're not able to sustain long-term relationships. And it gets scary. I'm 23, and it's starting to get, like, scary now. Like, seeing the way that people have become so emotionally disbarred from this stuff, And so, without going into too much detail, that was pretty much my experience. And it gets sobering when you get older. So just keep in mind, like we said at the beginning of this conversation, like, it's a responsibility thing. It's not purely for pleasure. It will catch up to you. Everything that you're doing, in terms of sexual dysfunction, it will catch up to you at some point. So just think about, like, where do you want to end up? If you want to end up in a stable, happy family situation, understand that everything in the world is pretty much working against you right now. Take responsibility, join the good fight, and, just don't get yourself in that hole for the most part.
Yeah. Any experience you want to share, Charlie?
Experiences that I've had, just to, like, add on to what Nati said. Also, yes, if, like, think about where you want to get to, but understand that sex will be presented to you in a way where it looks sweet in the beginning and it's amazing and it's fun, especially when you're younger. But the same people that are presenting it to you in a way where it's sweet and it's amazing and it's great or whatever are not going to pick you up in a season where sex did not serve you, where you're in your brokenness, where you have no one to look to, when you have that child with you and no one is supporting you but looking down on you. Those same people that told you about sex and how great it is and how you should go out and do what you want and be what you want on media, all these media platforms, pornography, even the cartoons, right? They start with our kids. They start with the children. Will not support women when they're going through the abortion. Will not support men when they can't find a spouse, or they can't lead families because they were so distracted in sexual behavior that they couldn't establish anything, establish businesses, establish homes. You will not be supported by any of these people that have pushed this agenda in the beginning. Because when it's sweet, but when it's bitter, it becomes very bitter and no one's there for you. So lean on the people that might sound bitter in the beginning, might sound a little difficult, but they care for you. You know what I mean? Because they know what the right end goal is. For me, my personal experience, I listened to a lot of people. Sex became very normal to me. It was like gradually, and I come from a community where sex is completely banned or shunned or looked down upon, the Habesha community. It's like a distant, it's like a distant thing, it's like not my children, but they never took the steps, they never had the conversations they needed to, about what sex is. It's always seen as a disgusting thing. But it should be talked about in a sense of like situations where you're listening to other people talk about sex in a damaging way. So for me, sex became very normal to the point where I fell into, I was in a relationship with someone and I lost my virginity to this person and it was very damaging to me. It honestly psychologically damaged me, emotionally damaged me. And I was very attached to this person. It wasn't like what my friends talked about it to be. Everybody normalized it. Everyone, moved around from different people and they seemed like they were okay. But for me, it was like such a brokenness, such a despair, such an emptiness that I felt. And I felt like I had to like fill that void always. It's a void that I created. It's a void that you create when you practice sex outside of what it needs to be, what God intended for it to be.
I think a lot of people experience exactly what you were talking about, but they just never make the connection like that it came, like the source of these things. You know what I mean? I think a lot of people carry that brokenness, carry the hardness that we're seeing, especially in men. You see more hardness, actually in both genders. You see like hardness, coldness, brokenness, mistrust, paranoia, all these other emotional things that people carry around for long, but they don't like put it together, like 2 and 2 together. Like, it's because like I'm talking to people that aren't committed to me, that don't even share the same soul, the same spirit, the same beliefs as me, who don't actually care about me. I'm disposable like this. These things all set in, you know what I mean? Because of how much you emotionally and psychologically are vulnerable during sex, for men and women alike. So just wanted to add that. That's all.
Yeah. And also with sex, I'm just going to say one more thing. It's really an intimate thing. You take on each other's spirit, really. You take on each other's form. Because I remember when I was with this person, that I lost my virginity to, he would always tell me, "Oh, I feel so happy or peaceful," and I was feeling anxious, right? The feelings that he had, I was taking on, and the peace that I had, right? He was taking on.
That's real. That was my exact same experience, interestingly. So,
and this is the reality. Everyone could say different, but if we really come down to like what's true, it's that. So this is how damage happens with sex. Sex is like the root of all evil, truly. Also for Christians, right?
When you say sex,
Sexual dysfunction,
the dysfunctional.
Yeah. Yes.
When it's not stewarded, when it's
Yes.
we have sex.
When it's outside of the
responsibly.
bounds of what God intended for it to be. God intends sex for life, for procreating, for intimacy with the spouse that God gives you, right?
Yeah.
because there's protection in that, because that person carries a spirit of God, right? And you carry a spirit of God. I always say, first, look to God, right? Find your identity in God. Find your wholeness in God. Sex should not be something that you need to go do. You know what I mean? It doesn't need to be something that you desire, that you need, you know, because it becomes damaging in marriages too. Like when sex is all it is, right? When you're constantly needing that instead of needing the affection of the person that you were married to, you know what I mean? That could also be damaging. So find your wholeness.
Even in a marital, in a heterosexual
Exactly. Sex can be evil. Yes. So like I said, in the bounds that God intended for it to be. So figuring out what God defined sex to be. You know what I mean?
It's true.
And that means protection. Sex is protection. Sex is love. Sex is forgiveness. You know, when a husband and a wife disagree or fight, it's a form of them coming together. Sex is worship. You know what I mean? On top of bringing life to this world. And leading generations, like bringing generations to come, like bringing generations to the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Before I move on to, the other issues that we're going to be talking and discussing, the one thing that you really, Shari, brought about is parental responsibilities in training kids about sex and the responsibility we have with that. That's amazing. You know, parents, we have not done good in this regard. It's banned. It's you don't talk about it, but it's a real life issue that these teenagers, young kids, go through, and they haven't had the freedom and the courage, even if they fail in this thing. First of all, we need to instruct them. But even if they fail, they don't have the freedom to come to us, to the parents, to mom and dad, and talk about this, and get help.
Yeah.
So that's a very significant point that you raise.
I went to my mom with my truth, like with what I was struggling in. I was struggling in emptiness. I was struggling in, constantly needing to fill this void, this door that I've opened, was damaging to me. But I remember God clearly speaking to me through someone at a lunch table with me, that person and my mom. And that person said, listen, you have opened doors. You need to close the doors and open one door for God to enter. And in that moment, I knew I had to tell my mom. No matter how she took it, no matter what her response was, I had to present it to my mother. So parents, my mom panicked. She cried. She said, how can this happen? Why? It was so much damage. But like for a second, it's like she received God's spirit, because she straightened up, looked at me and said, don't worry, my daughter, this will not be your end. The person that God has for you will come to you before you graduate. Her timing was impeccable, because the fact that she spoke these words and these words came to be true. The person that God had for me came to be my senior year, right when I graduated. And me and him have practiced abstinence for almost 3 years now. And we're growing. We're maturing. You know what I mean? It's so much different than what the world presented to me. I never thought I would live a life without sex, to be honest with you. That's what you think, with how the culture is and what you think. It becomes so normal. You're like, this is what needs to be. People can't fight it, so they normalize it. But there is a God that can free you. You just... turn to him, turn to the people around you that have sound things to say, about sex, and see how their life looks. There's a lot of people who followed the steps,
Wow.
And their lifestyle is so healthy. It's strong. They have families. They work well with their spouses, listen to those people.
Wow.
And God can speak through those people. So I guess that's my experience.
It's so amazing testimony. Wow.
Yeah.
It's very inspiring and very encouraging for those who hear right now. Robbie, is there anything you want, before I move on, the place or the role that pornography played in all this revolution, before I move on is there anything you want to add on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up with two parents who loved me, thankfully monogamous as far as I know. No, I'm playing. They were we should edit that out, but they were two loving parents, who spoke to me about these kind of things. As a young man, I think I was maybe about 10 years old. I was at a friend's house, we're hanging out in front of the computer, and one of them started showing us his favorite pornography site. And I remember thinking as a 10-year, I didn't know what I was looking at. I was looking at body parts I have never seen in my life. And I remember that starting a curiosity in me. And fast forward a few years later, I'm engaging in hookup culture, dating apps and things like that. And I would say that those women, I mean, it was very empty. It was very empty. And it was just very sensual and nothing else. And growing up now, when you really weigh out the pros and cons of both kind of ideas about sex, I'm now 100% only wanting to do that in marriage now. Because as a child, I have to think about it like, what kind of household do I want to live in? You know what I mean? Would I want to live in a household with two parents who love each other and just had sex with each other and that was exclusive to them? Or would I want to live in a household where the parents had loose morals about sex and had other children on the side and different family and cheating and all that stuff? And I want monogamous. I want to live in a monogamous household. So, yeah, my parents were right. So, mom, dad, thank you. You were right. Yeah, I can't see a better way to live life.
Anything to comment? When I look at the statistics, on pornography, there is no difference between Christian or non-Christian across religious spectrums. There was research done in a Christian college where 9 out of 10 experience pornography. Non-Christian setting probably will be the same. It's addicting. It's having impact, a lot of impact. The same impact, and going out and having sex with us. Mm-hmm. So any thoughts you have on pornography? You want to say something over here?
Yeah, most of the internet is porn. And then a lot of social media is just advertisement for porn. Right. Or for OnlyFans or cam stuff. So
you can find pornography in movies. Like, you don't even need to go to a porn website. Mm-hmm. There are no limits anymore. Movies back then, they would turn the camera right when they're about to kiss or whatever. It's not so innocent. True. It's not that's so. Yeah. It's not so PG anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very true.
So there's no restrictions on it.
Very sexual, yeah.
And like I said, this was my experience 15 years ago. You know what I mean? I can't imagine how accessible it is now. Absolutely. And I think when you have over $1 billion industry, the porn industry. You have advertisement where sex sells, where even television advertisement, YouTube advertisement is is sensual in some way. There's a lot of forces, to go against when we want to live a life that's pure, mm-hmm. or where we're saving ourselves for our partners. Mm-hmm. Right? You just kind of you can't turn on any screen and avoid that. So it's virtually impossible.
Wow. One thing I want to add to that real quick is from every angle, sex is going to be coming at you. There's whatever. But one thing that's helpful to look at it is from an individual point of view. What is the door? What is the main door that you open in your life to actually succumb to all of that stuff? What I've learned through experience, through sitting down with people younger than me, older than me, and I think Shalom was kind of hinting at this, is it usually comes from some kind of false image that you have of yourself, that you begin to start to use sex and all things sex as a drug, basically. That's usually the door, oftentimes, not the only door, but that's usually the one that, allows sex and sexual addiction as a drug to enter people's lives, I can specifically talk about guys. I know women can usually say the same thing, when they're rationalizing why did I participate in those kind of things. It's because usually they had a low self-esteem or a bad self-image about themselves, and that's why they want to engage. For guys, it's almost always the same thing. If you want to talk about the context of porn, most guys just do it because they feel it's out of a sense of hopelessness a lot of the time, or a false self-image of I'm not going to be anywhere. I'm not going to do anything. I hate this about myself. There's so many things. And so I think, you have to kind of learn to toughen up and adapt to the culture that we live in. You're not going to really run from it. You can try and live in a bubble, but this is just the times that we live in. Sex is profitable. It's there. It's going to be all around us. I don't know for how much longer. I mean, you have to, work a little bit harder to address the inner thing. What is that door that I'm opening? What is that false self-image that I have, about myself? that I want to use sex as a drug, So like any other drug that you would ask.
And have the conversations, right, with the people around you, with what you're going through. Like Robel said, those body parts became a curiosity to you. Did you feel like you could take it to anyone?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah. See, like parents, rise up to it, ask your kids, if they've heard about anything or seen anything, and try to if it's when they come to an appropriate age, first of all, guard what they're watching, guard the people they're around, guard the school they're going to, try to be involved, be invested. But once they come of age, have those conversations with them and let them know that they have a safe place to come to, if they're going through struggles in that area.
Yeah, and I'll say
maybe going to help kids maybe get out of sexual addictions. I would like you guys and give a comment on that. But one of the reasons kids or young adults engage in this kind of activities, pornography, is to really get relieved of stress, and it's associated with mental illness, anxiety, depression. Some of them so that they see that as a medicine or as a way out of relieving of their depression, relieving of their anxiety. So
social anxiety.
So what are the causes of those anxiety, and is there no a better way of dealing with mental illness? Is that the right way to, or would that complicate and open up the door for another kind of problem, and then it compounded?
Yeah.
It compounds it.
Right.
It definitely opens the door to bigger problems, like the inability to actually connect with a woman in real life, in a romantic setting, because a lot of these guys, their entire experience with women and romantically is on a screen. There's actually a lot of guys. There's a huge phenomenon of guys just paying to have virtual girlfriends online and stuff like that. And as we're living more and more in the metaverse online, more
or
and
not
more
being satisfied with your significant other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's digging a hole. They're digging themselves into a hole even deeper,
And
because
you're
they're
going to
not,
bury yourselves.
they're not, and they don't see how, I don't think we see as a society now how much porn affects ability for men and women to actually get together in real life. Yeah.
Oh. So there's so many other ways, avenues of dealing with anxiety, with depression, with this kind of mental illnesses, rather than resorting to a wrong prescription. That would open up doors for more deeper problems. So what one advice you have, young adults, for those who are really entangled, in addiction, in sexual addiction? One thing you say, talk to someone. Is there anything you want to say, and you guys as well?
I think first of all, identify, are you someone that is fighting against it, or if you're someone that's going along with it. If you're going along with it, we try to deconstruct why it definitely is just a bad path to go down. If you're someone that's struggling with these kind of sexual addictions, you can say, as a result of trying to relieve anxiety or to try to deal with your internal problems, yes, talk with people. Definitely, you have to own up and face it. That's kind of what I was getting at with addressing that negative self-image that you have. I don't know. I think that's pretty much what I have. Yeah.
Anything else?
I will
advice you have
say-
for those who are struggling. What does help you get out of it?
What helped me?
Yes.
I would say Jesus.
That's good. Great. Go ahead, tell us. Your experience.
I will say Christ freed me from a lot of things, and he never attacked me with where I was at. He never made me feel shameful or ashamed of me being entangled in this situation of having sexual sin or desiring sex. He kind of just loved me, and he had me tell my truth of where I was at. So really just for Christians to seek him out, he will give you freedom. It's a personal walk with him that you have to take. He'll point you into that direction, but it starts with understanding that it is very wrong and that it is detrimental that you run to him. It is so important. Do not allow it to just grow, and do not fall accustomed to it, don't get comfortable with it. Don't allow other people who are pushing it to feed your minds. Try to like, stay away from those people. Try to like just shut everything out and say, God, speak to me. If this is causing me to my doom, if this is causing me to fall, if this will bring me no future, no purpose, if this does not align with what you have created me to be, because he is the designer. You know what I mean? He is the designer of our bodies. He knows what we need. He knows what is healthy to our bones, healthy to our bodies, healthy to our minds. God does not want damage to anything that he has created. He doesn't intend for that to happen. There is an enemy that is out to steal, kill, and destroy. And identifying that, and also listening to what God instructs you to do. When he instructs you, you will find your freedom. When you follow his will, you will find freedom. But I didn't see any other way out for myself from all that
great.
despair that sex caused, or that it wasn't just sex, but it was what the world caused, But sex was one of the main things. It was the very thing that I used to rebel against the Lord.
Wow.
It was my crossing over, and it caused so much damage. But God still restores. God heals. Don't think it's too late for you. There's freedom for you.
Amen.
So,
Yeah. There's a guy who said, there's laws to everything. Yeah. There's the law of gravity. When you break the law of gravity, you don't break the law. You break yourself.
Yeah.
So when you break the laws of sex, the very purpose that intended for, you're breaking yourself. So it's true. So your relationship with God, your relationship with Christ was huge in getting liberated.
Yeah.
Any more advices or?
Yeah, that's such a great point. Jordan Peterson says, I've never seen anybody get away with anything. And meaning that every action you take now will have a consequence either now or later, or even internally and psychologically in a way that you can't even comprehend consciously. And there's this podcast called Fight the New Drug, which is where ex-pornographers or porn stars talk about the dark side to pornography, things that most people don't really understand that goes down in the production of porn. And that podcast taught me that a lot of these women, and for those who are struggling, and maybe this will help you, is knowing that the person on the other end of the screen might be drugged and might be getting raped on camera, might be trafficked, might have been kidnapped, might be underage, or might be manipulated, you know what I mean, for money or for drugs, or extorted for money or for drugs. That person might be a product of abuse and is just lost right now. And we are contributing to that. There's no such thing as free porn, because it stains your mind. It stains your ability to think innocently about women.
And hurt people. These
Absolutely.
people are damaged. They're not gonna try to build you. They're gonna damage you.
Yeah.
Because they're damaged.
Any resources great resource that you mentioned. Is there any other resources that people can go to, if they want to get free from this kind of sexual addictions?
Yeah, Fight the New Drug. It's a great podcast. That's such a really good one. I do think that they have a hotline for help. Again, a lot of things that we don't know is that men who are in rehab centers because of this, that we don't talk about that. Men who have lost thousands of dollars in life savings paying for porn. And so, yeah, there's hotlines available like Fight the New Drug that I recommend.
I think we can move on to the context for sex. Now, it's growing now. We have this sexual relationship, not only in a heterosexual environment, but in a homosexual environment. This is very common right now in this culture. So I think we need to talk about the context for sex in light of the purpose, and would this be appropriate in light of our nature and the consequence as well. So for me, when we talk about sex, sex has to be done in a marital context between man and a woman, and in a heterosexual context, it's evident that we're trying to fight with something that is self-evident. The way we created speaks in such volume, the binary nature, the procreation aspect of having a family, in forming real, meaningful, affectionate, romantic relationship. So in so many ways, for me, the appropriate context for sex in the heterosexual context, so we can really unpack a little bit on these relationships and what we recommend about this and what our thoughts and perspectives on this as well.
I'll just say this very short because I think my opinion is pretty short. I think, just as Dr. Beza said, like biology and psychology alone already make a case for the correct context of sex. I think just biologically, like, without being lewd, like I think the edifices or whatever they may be, they speak for themselves. You know what I mean? Anything outside of that, people like to do things for their own pleasure, but at the end of the day, that's where the psychological, I think, parts of it speak for themselves, right? I think a lot of the people who engage in sex in dysfunctional or alternative ways, a lot of it, controversially, I may be able to say this, but I think a lot of it is rooted in psychological instability and deception for the most part. I think people who undergo a lot of like deviant sexual behaviors or even have deviant sexual identities and stuff like that, a lot of it does oftentimes comes from a psychological place of instability. So I think biology and psychology alone make a case that, like, in the context of marriage and between a heterosexual man and woman, for the most part, is the safest place for society and for the family and between two people for sex to occur. So
I to add on this, a fallen human nature, but also a distorted culture. Prevent this as something that is right. And in this cultural push as well. Right. But also, there's a hate behind it. Growing up in a dysfunctional families, when maybe growing, having a hate towards the other sex might give us, attraction toward the other sex. If I hate women, I could be attracted to men. Or if I hate, a woman hating men for several reasons, it's rooted in their life experience. When we think of the real issues, so there are so many factors that are making it, it is presented in a distorted way in the culture. So there's a fallen human nature, but because this has not been an issue in our today's society, it might be visible. It's being supported, and it was presented as normal, but it has been since culture, since human society. So there is a fallen human nature. That there is a rebellion in our heart, towards God, towards the order of creation. And also on that, growing up in a dysfunctional family, hate could be behind that real life experiences and culture, So some I hear people talk about this from a genetics, from a biological point of view, but there is almost no evidence to talk about, that, because this is something that is cultural, this is something that is behavioral, this is something that is born out of an experience of a dysfunctional family. And we see and hear testimonies of people who were gays or lesbians or having homosexual partnerships, and later in life they said, we're wrong, we're not right. That tells you a lot about this. It's not rooted in our nature. It is not rooted in human nature. It is rooted in our fallen behavior. It's rooted in culture. It's rooted in our experiences that we had in the past, and in growing up in a dysfunctional family where you see, a husband, abusing his wife, or a wife, abusing her husband. And growing up in that kind of environment as kids, would you be not tempted not to get attracted towards the same sex? If you see that it's not fulfilling, I can find love in the same sexual partner. But when you look at the nature, when you look at the order of creation, in the purpose of sex, in the future of society, I'm not saying that two men cannot parent, and provide what that kid wants. Right. Two women cannot. Right. A kid wants both a man and a woman figure. And a woman nature, and nurturing, and a guy and a leader in his life, one who nurtures and one who guides and leads, and that could only be found, in the heterosexual context. So I deeply argue and recommend this as well. And anything you want to add on this?
I feel like it can be found in God's design, right? And when you say heterosexual relationships or marriages, that's what he designed. So when you follow what he designs, he rewards, right? He blesses. That's where all the fruitfulness comes from in the end. That's where all the good comes from. The other side is damage, right? When you follow the things that are rebellious against God's design, it causes death. But everything that results from following his design is life, abundance, right? So leaning on that and understanding that that is the end, and seeing results of other people. You can learn from other people's experience around you to see what they followed and kind of weigh out your pros and cons of what we're saying here, Be like, okay, is this true? Let me go see. And asking your communities, go around your neighborhoods, see what causes broken families, broken people, and see what causes healthy families and healthy people. I feel like that is important. But God rewards. When you follow his design, he rewards.
Oh.
Yeah.
Robbie?
Yeah, I agree 100% with what you said about, and what you said is true, given that both parents have a healthy relationship with the father in his masculinity and the woman in her femininity, because you could grow up in a heterosexual family because sometimes children are innocent, they don't understand men and women and the differences. Having a masculine father will ensure that if a boy does start acting like a girl, or start, that, hey, we don't do that, you're a man, act like a man, and that takes strength, and that takes a serious level of conviction, and that's a part of masculinity, because if you're going to, that's okay, do you, that child needs to be steered into the right direction. Even in their own innocence, they can make a mistake in thinking that there's something that they're not. And if that's being,
nurtured,
affirmed, then that could be really dangerous for a child who doesn't know much about how the world works, and needs to be corrected and separated from the girls and say, hey, we don't do this. You're a boy. This is how, and it has to be taught. Masculinity has to be taught. This is what we do as men. We dress like this. We act like this. We provide. We protect. And so there is that. Those principles that need to be instilled, and 100%. And that goes into the conversation with masculinity and femininity.
Oh.
Which we already did. So just go watch that.
Yeah, we already did. Go ahead and watch that. We did a whole series on masculinity and femininity.
What advice you have, or people, we need to be compassionate, we need to be gracious enough to deal with those who have attraction to our same sex or have this homosexual relationships. What advices you have? And also, one thing I want, before we go there, one thing I want to add, the legal battle that we have right now when it comes to right, is purely based on, even the argument we had in the Supreme Court in the US was that we are creators of meaning. That was how the justices, those who have been supporting this, argue for. And if we are creators of meaning, then if reality is something that's given, that we need to embrace rather than define, then where would this end up? If you don't have what's going to be the basis for legislating? Where would the basis for having laws? Where would this lead to? At the end of the day, it's going to lead to anarchy and lawlessness. We are fighting with reality. We are becoming anti-realistic. So anything is permissible. So then there is no ground for not, prohibiting something, even murder. What would be the basis for? There has to be some basis. Why not? Because we value life, And then even when we argue in the sexual relationships, then where would that end? Why not polygamy? Why not incest? Why not pedophilia? Why not having sex with animals? Of course, this has been there now. We open a floodgate, and allow everything to be permissible now. So it's on the increase. Pedophilia is on the increase. Even pressurized, or what do you call? I don't know the right name. Forced to have sex. Rape is on the increase. Abuse on the increase. Having sex with animals. And what does that mean? That means diseases that means that has a public implication too. You know, when I have brought that the infection from animal, then it's going to be transmitted to human beings. And in the future is really we're entering into a future where it's very, what we call,
Dystopian.
horror.
Okay.
It's like horrific
Yeah.
that everything is permissible. So there will be no ground for prohibiting anything. So you can add on that and then go on to, wherever, yes, we need to present the truth in love. Yes, we're not here to promote hate towards any group. We're called to love. We're called to be gracious. But also we are here to tell truth, because it's truth that liberates us. It's truth that brings freedom. It's
True.
a lie, a deception that brings enslavement. So you can say anything on this and then have your own recommendations.
I feel like true love calls for honesty. Like you said, Dr. Bezalem, we're not trying to promote hate towards any specific group. We're just speaking honesty based off of what we've seen, what we've experienced, what works, what's talked about. We want people to question these things. I feel like communities can be led astray. Like you said, Dr. Bezalem, if there isn't order, I feel like humans can be led in any direction, right? So it's either evil leading communities and people, or it's good. You know what I mean? So just to be steered in the right direction is why we're having these discussions. We are spreading love, but we're also spreading honesty. And we want to target things that are important and that need to be talked about. So, yeah. So just honesty is what we're really trying to push for, I guess, right?
Right.
Yeah. And I think if we're being honest, Dr. Beza put it very eloquently, like the logic, we are on a slippery slope. That is the objective fact of it, is we cannot justify any of the things that Dr. Beza talked about being unjust, And so that's why it calls on us to be honest as a community, as a society, to understand, okay, people who may be having these sorts of feelings and desires that they want to be able to form relationships around these feelings and desires, we have to be responsible. Again, theme of responsibility coming up. We have to ask, okay, we have these desires, but is this actually what the best outcome for society, for the family, and for community is, right? Mm-hmm. And if not, then it is incumbent on us, no matter how comfortable and how much pleasure we have around us, we have to look at these desires and say, can we really build a societal base off of this, Mm-hmm. And we're trying to do that now. And Dr. Beza, again, he put it very eloquently, we are on a slippery slope. Because we want to institutionalize and normalize, the relationships that are formed out of, for example, homosexual desires, we are now opening the door, the floodgates, so to speak, for so many of the other things. So, yeah, definitely you have to look at it from responsibility, right? Not all desires that we have are fruitful to produce relationships from, to build societies out of, to build families out of. So, definitely. At least if you're someone, if he's talking about being compassionate, about trying to understand from an individual point of view, the kind of desires that you may be dealing with and stuff like that, look at the bigger picture outside of the things that you may be desiring, or maybe the desire that you're struggling against, right? Look where it can lead and ask, is that really the way that humanity is supposed to go?
Mm-hmm.
So
because we can't be, because we can't be selfish, It's not just about us. Like I always say, when it becomes about us is when it becomes very damaging to ourselves, to everyone around us. We have to think in the viewpoint of the society, children, innocent children, right? When you open one door, there's going to be so many doors opened. There's no end point to it. There needs to be order to protect children. To build up the next generation, to protect society.
Yep.
So yeah,
especially the children.
Yeah,
they're getting formed the most out of our mistakes. So we have to be responsible in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say, most homosexuals decide that they're homosexual at a very young age. Mm-hmm. They decide that very young because they're led to believe that you have enough cognitive ability to make such a profound decision at such a young age. Yeah. We know that for most men, the prefrontal cortex is fully developed only after 25 years old, in men, and so you could be wrong, and maybe if you're an adult, maybe revisit. Am I the way I am because of what happened to you?
Yeah.
A culture, maybe some teachers, maybe you were groomed. I don't know. Like really revisit what were the factors that made you this way.
Dysfunctional families.
Dysfunctional families, and really try to see why you are the way you are. And if you believe that gender is fluid and sexuality is fluid, then exercise that fluidity and try to be heterosexual and see if that helps you. I know I had a I had a gay friend. You know, I had a gay friend, coworker, and he told me if he could choose, he would be straight. So much of his problems were caused by being gay. So much of his feeling like he's ostracized from society, problems with family, and just this innate feeling of not being normal. You know, so use that fluidity and try to become straight.
And like, if trying to become straight, I'll like disagree with that. If trying to become straight is not natural to you, does not feel natural to you, I'll also say talk to your creator, seek out your creator, seek out God, seek out Jesus, the God that died for us, you know, died for our sins, was tempted in this world, knows everything we experience, built our bodies, knows how it functions. Talk to him. You know, he will lead you and steer you into the right direction. He will free you from those desires. You know, those desires are caused by so many things, so much influence around you, evil around you, you know. But like, when you listen to his still voice, it'll guide you. It'll take those desires away from you. It'll bring you closer to him. And then you will follow his design. And his design is heterosexuality. But also in heterosexuality, there can be, you know, premarital sex outside of marriage, cheating on your spouse. There's so much evil in heterosexuality as well. So we're not here, you know, trying to pinpoint and attack homosexuals. We're attacking.
There's no challenges or.
Yeah, we understand.
There's a risk associated with everything. You know, if you want to fly with a plane, there's a possibility. There is a risk. You know, and in flying, with everything, there is a perverted way of doing it. So stay within the bounds of what God has, or what the Creator has for us. You know,
because His ways are safety.
Whatever it's heterosexual marriage, even within that context, we know so there are so many issues that needs to be dealt. But you know, one thing that needs to be underlined is that because we have issues with heterosexual marriage does not mean that it's wrong. You know, we should look for alternative ways. No, fix it.
Yes.
We should not run from the right thing. We fix that problem there rather than, you know, looking for alternatives. Because those alternatives are much more worse than the one that is right. So if there's any, you know, if you see 6 fingers, you don't advocate that men have 6 fingers. You know, it's not. That's abnormal. Yeah. That's not right. Yeah. Stay within the writing and make this. And we know that we will have problems with heterosexual marriage too, but
stay in line with what works.
What works
and
what's right
and what's right.
Good and what's beautiful.
But if you can't, go to the one that, you know, instructed it, the one that designed it, the one that knows how it functions, the author of it all, you know.
Align with reality.
Yeah.
You know, because behind reality, there is design. Behind reality, there is creator.
Yeah, and don't attach your identity to your sexual behavior. You know, you're not what you do, you know, in the bedroom, you know. And there is a lie that says that, you know, it's just who you are. That your sexual behavior is embedded into who you are as a person. But as we discussed, there's so many social factors that we're not aware of. And so just consider that you may not be a homosexual to the core. It may be something that you can unravel with deep work. And like you said, with God. And just consider that as a possibility. Because it has been for so many people.
I think we can wrap up this discussion by addressing the root cause for almost all social evils is a dysfunctioning family. You know, we need to have a thriving, you know, functioning families. All these social problems that we see are emanating with kids growing up in a dysfunctional family. So, even heterosexual marriage in society. Let's be responsible, and have a functioning family, a loving, caring, respecting family at home, and a woman nurturing their kids, a man providing leadership for his kids, providing protection, guidance, direction, safety, respecting and honoring, loving one another. So this would really, help the next generation. The next generation are rebelling against what they have seen at home. So I just want to leave this discussion here. If you want to have any concluding thoughts, you're welcomed.
For people who are successful in this area, I call on you to take the responsibility to, speak up and speak out on what works, what's been working for you, how God has been moving in your lives, in your marriages, how he's built successful. I feel like there's so many communities who are just living peacefully, happily, not really going out and speaking in areas where there's so much corruption and evil and brokenness. They're just enjoying their livelihoods. But you have a call, to go and impact communities that are broken, be a guide to them, be examples to them. So yeah, take that responsibility.
Yeah. Truth cannot be rejected, Truth cannot be denied. Truth is always true. Truth can only be rejected or denied when it is not presented well. Mm-hmm. Speak and let's speak clearly and courageously. Yeah. And let us present it well. That's very important. Anything Nathan wants to say last, and then Robbie will conclude, and we'll conclude this.
I think you guys nailed it. I think especially she nailed it. Like, understand that it's a war on family. Assess why is family so important. See the societal outcome when you scale a community of families and whatnot. You see that that's the best outcome for humanity. Understand that, the things that violate that jeopardize that destabilize that. And, speak up about these things. Advocate for people who are in a place of confusion, as we talked about. A lot of this stuff can come from confusion, from desires, and then tying identity to desires and whatnot. So, be a light for those people as much as you can, as Shalom said. And, we need to continue to talk about it, definitely.
Yeah, and I'll say for the men and women to really, really take some time to consider, what is it you want out of sex? Ultimately, if you were to follow that desire to its conclusion, is to procreate. And I think it's time that we, as a society, regardless of your age, that we just mature and think 100 years from now, 200 years from now, what do you want your family name to mean? When your great-great-grandchildren come across a picture of you, do you want them to resonate deeply with pride in who you are, or not know who you are or what you've contributed? If you actually want to build a legacy, you have to build a strong family. Men, women together, monogamous, have children and raise those children right and protect them from all this nonsense that the media is pushing on us about sex and promiscuity, and reject it and live clean lives. And I think that your children, your great-grandchildren, who none of them were accidents, will appreciate you. And I think that can help a lot. We can just tighten up when it comes to sex. Do not see indulgence as freedom. People who are addicted to sex, addicted to porn, there's no freedom in that. That's not freedom. That's bondage. Freedom is the ability to abstain and to be rational about when you lay down with somebody. And I think that's a value that's being lost right now.
It's a great conversation. Thank you, guys. I hope this conversation will be helpful to so many. And I just want to thank you all for your honesty and transparency, and for making this time as a team. Thank you so much.
Thank you.